Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our second in-person and online Stoicon-X Melbourne for 2022. Thank you to our friends and partners, the global modern Stoicism movement, which supports Stoicon-X events around the world. We're grateful to the Greek Centre for Contemporary Culture and the Greek community of Melbourne, which has hosted us now for the second time and supported us all the way. The Bevington Group has provided considerable assistance for our event. Tim Gregory of the Stoic Supply Store is here today with his excellent Stoic-inspired merchandise. Most of all, thanks to you for supporting Stoicism in Australia by coming along. I know some of you have flown into Melbourne for this event, which is lovely. Also, many Melburnians are out in force. Some people here also attended last February. Others are here for their very first Stoicon gathering. It's important to build community. So can I suggest that you introduce yourself to people in your row or in the coffee and lunch break? So how did you get interested in Stoicism? Or are you doing Stoic Week this year? Is a great way to start. We don't want anyone to leave today without meeting at least one new person. If you wish, you can make your own name label to help people have a way of addressing you. There are stickers and pens at the back, but it's optional. Just some housekeeping to get started. Toilets are on your right, coffee thoughtfully provided behind you by the wonderful people from the Greek Centre. And as indicated, please browse the Stoic Supply Store goodies in the coffee breaks. Lunch today is not booked, but Lynn Vu, who is a member of our organising team, will let us know of a local eatery where several people will be attending and everyone is welcome to buy lunch together. If you look at your program, you'll see that at 5 p.m, after the formal activities today, there will be optional drinks at Fable, which is the rooftop bar on the 13th level of this building. If you'd like to come along, please let me know prior to lunchtime so I can text the numbers to Fable as they're keen to have an idea. After drinks, there will be time to head to Syndos Greek Restaurant up the road where we have our pre-booked dinner, which has been very popular this year. I'd like to introduce our Stoicon-X Melbourne team. Associate Professor Matthew Sharp, Deakin University and Think Inc. Roger Perry, CEO of the Bevington Group and Melbourne Stoa. Lynn Vu, business owner and Melbourne Stoa. Shannon Murray, student and member of the online Stoic community Stoa Antipodeia. And I'm Judith Stove, a Sydney writer, member of Stoa Antipodeia and also a contributor to the Walled Garden online philosophical community where Simon Drew and I have a podcast called Soul Searching with Seneca. And if you'd like to help organise the next Stoicon-X Melbourne, please see one of us today. Now I'm going to give you a very quick introduction to Stoicism. Many of you will know the basics, but it will set the scene for our event today. The philosophical school called the Stoa was founded in around 301 BC by Zeno, a businessman who had lost everything in a shipwreck. Zeno was from Cyprus, but the school he founded was in Athens at the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch. The Stoics drew heavily on the teachings of Socrates, as handed down by Plato and Xenophon, as Socrates left nothing written himself. Like Socrates, they insisted that a person can live a good life if they pursue virtue, specifically the 4 cardinal virtues: wisdom, justice, self-control, and courage. After the Greek city-states were finally defeated militarily and politically by the emerging power of Rome, many Greek philosophers came to Rome and influenced the culture there. These included Stoics. Stoicism was a good fit with Roman ideas about duty, and by the 1st century BC, intellectuals such as the lawyer and politician Cicero and his friends were consciously forming philosophical communities as representatives of the different schools. Stoicism and Epicureanism were followed by many. Cicero also translated works of Plato into Latin. Now, the first emperor of Rome, Augustus, had a Stoic advisor called Arius. But Stoic philosophers didn't always get on with the emperors. And Seneca, many of whose Stoic writings survive, also survived banishment, came back to work for Nero, but eventually fell out of favour. Seneca's surviving works include his letters to Lasalius, his tragic plays, his consolations, and his scientific works. Musonius Rufus, a homegrown Italian teacher of Stoicism who lectured in Greek, which was still considered the language of philosophy, was also banished from Rome. Musonius's most famous student was Epictetus, a former slave of a freed man, which is also a former slave, who had held a high position at Nero's court. Epictetus's lectures were written down by one of his students, Arrian, and the works we have are the discourses and a summary version called the Enchiridion, which means handbook. Just here we've got a very famous depiction of Epictetus, which is not particularly authentic because it's from the early modern period. But here is also a photo of the theatre in his hometown, Hierapolis, now called Pamukkale in Turkey. The final ancient writer, whose substantial works survive, is the 2nd century CE Emperor Marcus Aurelius, whose work Meditations, perhaps more accurately, Es ta heauton, Things to Himself, has been highly influential, and Marcus in his turn was strongly influenced by Epictetus. That's it. By far the majority of ancient works, Stoic works, have disappeared. There are fragments quoted in other writers, but necessarily these lack context. But we do know enough to have a good idea of the Stoic worldview. 3 key interlocking areas of Stoic philosophy are the physics, or the scientific account of the world, logic, or forms of reasoning, and ethics. The first 2 can be very technical and comparatively dry, so we don't tend to cover them in meetings such as this. As I mentioned, the key principle of Stoic ethics is that virtue is the only good. This can be confronting. Surely having good health is a good thing. Yes, but the Stoics would say you can still have a good life without good health. That doesn't mean that we should be indifferent in the sense of uncaring about whether we live in a healthy way or not. We aren't Milo the great athlete, Epictetus tells us, but we should still exercise and train in a healthy way. Another key principle was that the best kind of life is a life according to nature. I discussed this at some length at our last Stoicon, and you can check that out on the Stoics Australia YouTube channel. Living according to nature for the Stoics meant living using our capacity for rational thought, which has been given to us by the gods, and living virtuously, as we just described. Now, one important tool for living rationally is our power of prohairesis, or choice. When something appears to us to be a certain way, either desirable, say, or terrifying, we can mentally take a moment to consider whether it truly is that way. The Stoics would say that if we examine prospects before us in this way, we are far less likely to think of things as desirable or terrifying. Another tool is what's commonly known as the dichotomy of control, which is not a great term, as it wasn't one known to the ancients. Epictetus reminds us to consider what is up to us and what is not up to us, which aspects of a situation are in our power to do something about and which are not. This is a very powerful tool for everyday life, and it's no wonder that for many it's become synonymous with Stoicism. We are going to examine Stoic practices later today, but suffice to say that Stoicism is an eminently practical way of thinking about the world. It also gives us ways of approaching the worst things which can happen in life: illness, death of loved ones, our own inevitable death, with calmness and acceptance. Some very influential thinkers today, and some in the past, have gone around saying that life is suffering. Now, that's not a position that the ancient Stoics would have agreed with. For them, nature and fortune give and take. We each have good things in our lives, along with times of pain and unhappiness. Approaching both the good times and the not so good from a Stoic point of view can greatly improve our well-being. Stoicism itself has had good times and bad times in succeeding history. In the early modern period, the influence of Stoicism, largely through Seneca, on writers from France and England in particular, was profound. And here we have Michel de Montaigne, a great writer who was influenced by Stoicism. This also continued into the mid-18th century with the great writers of the Enlightenment, much indebted to the Stoics. But things went downhill from there, for reasons good and not so good. And by the mid-20th century, hardly anyone had a good word to say for Stoicism. Today, things are very different, thanks to the efforts of many scholars in the UK, Europe, and USA. I'm glad to say that here in Australia, we have one of the leaders in this Stoic revival, in Associate Professor Matthew Sharp of Deakin University, who is known globally for his work on philosophy as a way of life. If you haven't read Matt's brilliant work, then I hope you will. And we're so glad today that later on he will introduce his recent book, Stoicism, Bullying and Beyond. I would like to invite Matt to come on stage to introduce our first speaker today.